So we're here today talking about your new book, The Man of Peace, which is a pictorial history of the Dalai Lama's life that you have written on the inspiration of, I understand, William Myers' wife, whose last wish was that her husband bring forward the importance of His Holiness to the world. And, that you...
In the form of a graphic novel.
In the form of a graphic novel.
Giant comic book, yes.
And that you have been fundamental in making that wish come true. And also you have the help of Michael Burbank, who's helped you in many other projects here at Menla. And it's wonderful to be here at Menla with you in this beautiful place on this winter day.
Thank you.
And I'm very excited to talk to you about this book because I think it is very important to the world, and I'd like to understand, what was your inspiration personally to work on this project?
Well, previous work I had written was called Why the Dalai Lama Matters. And I guess I've associated with the Dalai Lama now for 53 years. And I really think that he has a better vision for the planet and of life than most of the people who are leading us in the world today, most of our leaders. And but his vision is not appreciated, and even one of the biggest empires now in the world is the Chinese one, and he's even they are his enemy. They consider him their enemy. So I just think that this story of this man who non-violently insists that wars should be over, period, that non-violence is more powerful, and that the planet is now coming into a period of peacefulness and not repeating the century of bloodshed, he refers to it, which we call the 20th century, and comes to a 21st century of peace. I think that deserves a broader hearing. And people are inspired by the Dalai Lama. They come out in the tens of thousands when he does a talk or something in a stadium or something like that. He doesn't try to do like masses to them because they're not Buddhists, and he doesn't want to convert people. He wants people to be spiritual in their own traditions, but to avoid that kind of competition. Still, he's the voice of peace, and people think he's unrealistic. So it's important that they see his life and how he has suffered and yet bravely kept up his tradition against that empire and all of those other empires and oligarchies that are supporting that empire, to try to save his people and actually to share that saving with all the people, because the whole people in the world don't want to have war now. They don't want to follow bad leaders. So that's why I did it. When William Myers brought the idea of doing it in the form of a graphic novel that could be read by younger people, I thought this is wonderful, and this should be central to the mission of Tibet House, which is to preserve Tibetan culture. And I guess you could say in a way that Dalai Lama is the Tibetan culture's like most extraordinary artifact. You know, in the sense that he was educated there, he grew up there, what he learned was from there, although he now connects it back to India, which Tibetan culture comes from, the Buddhist India. And he calls himself a son of India as well, you know, so India and Tibet together.
Well, what makes the Dalai Lama believe that nonviolence is possible? What do you think?
He's sort of I guess you'd say he's a professional silver lining discerner. You know, other people think something's going terribly wrong, but the Dalai Lama sees people, he sees the people. It's like Gandhi, you know, when someone said to Gandhi when one of his strikes didn't work out because some of the people became violent, and they asked him how did he find the strength to carry on seemingly such a difficult and hopeless task. And he said, well, some people did violence, and you know, 30, 40 people had suffered injuries and some were killed. He said, but millions of people didn't do violence in that same time. So I'm remembering the millions of people who are behaving in a certain way. And the Dalai Lama has a wonderful thing which we detail in the epilogue, where he says that in 1900 there was nobody in the populations of the planet who questioned war. Everybody, you know, the generals, the kings, the emperors, they all had big armies, and war was a thing, and colonialism was like sort of great, supposedly, you know. And at the beginning of the 21st century, although we had the idiot invasion of of Iraq, and too much so we had war, but nobody really liked it. Nobody wanted it, actually. Leaders pushed the world into it, but people didn't want it, and they protested hugely against it. Similarly, in 1900, people just threw stuff, and polluters polluted, and factories burned this and that, and they never thought twice about it. And in 2000, most intelligent people are aware that we're practically destroying life on Earth with the climate overheating, climate transformation into a desert, basically. And so people now the people are aware of that. The governments may be in denial of it, but the people are aware of it. And similarly, he talks about, in 1900, people thought either capitalism or communism or fascism or something was going to solve all problems. So they built those big, huge government buildings, and they had big institutions. They thought that sort of systems were going to win and save the world. And now they realize systems have just crashed into one another, and the individuals are going to have to take responsibility, and they're going to have to be democratic, and they're going to have to all vote, and then see to it they have a good government. And final thing is, in 1900, everyone thought materialism would remake the world, and materialistic science would cure every disease and satisfy every hunger and do everything. And this obviously has not happened, and there's big disasters going on everywhere, and materialism by itself. So now people are looking at spiritual science, beginning to think there's some sort of what the Indians would call inner science, and which is really what Buddhism is inner science. And so these four things are his four reasons for hope, that the 21st century will be different from the 20th century, which he has lived by. And I believe he has a realistic vision of that, personally. I also share that vision, but not very many people do. They think it's sort of la la land, if you will, and not the movie. They think it's like that, and that he's wasting his time. He should really get an army, or he should have a war someone should have a war with China, and then even some young Tibetans think that. But of course, I don't agree with that, and I think we're going to see big change soon, because sooner or later, the masses of people, when they really stand up, then the governments really have to listen. If they can be fooled, if their votes can be suppressed, if they can be calmed by brainwashed by dishonest media, which I mean that Fox News, not CNN, then temporarily the bad guys can dominate and calm them. But long run, I don't think they can keep that up.
That's wonderful. Is this one of the reasons why you focused on a lot of the political aspects of His Holiness's life, so that you could bring forward this message of his?
Absolutely. His Holiness, of course, he's a great spiritual teacher and a spiritual leader. And one of his great spiritual teachings is not to make himself into an international guru. Some people may think he's an international guru, and in a way he sort of indirectly is. But he always says in non-Buddhist countries, don't be a Buddhist. I'm not teaching you these things so that you can become a Buddhist. I want you to use whatever you learn to improve your life, but stay culturally within whatever you were born with, whatever your grandmother's religion was. I'm not asking you to convert. We should stop converting each other. He says to the popes, he says to the Archbishop of Canterbury, he says it to Muslim leaders in India who he has talked to. He thinks that religion should not become source of conflict, and the competition for market share will cause that, as we are seeing that it does. And so he doesn't want to join in that. So his reason for traveling the world is to represent the genocide, the ethnocide, if you will, or maybe even genocide, that is being inflicted on his people for geopolitical reasons by the Chinese leadership, which has been doing that for 60 years. But luckily, most of the Tibetans are still surviving. Maybe 1/6 of them were killed off, actually, unnaturally due to that. But there's still 5-6 million of them.
So these are really big ideas. This is a lot of information to try to convey in a single book, and particularly in a book that is graphic in nature.
Yes.
So what were some of the challenges in writing the book and condensing these big ideas into?
Well, they're His Holiness's ideas, luckily, and he lives the ideas so people can see him living them. Mm-hmm. And also there's quite a lot about His Holiness's own spiritual breakthroughs and his studies. He openly admits to people that when he was a teenager, he was very bored, he wanted to watch movies, he didn't want to study Buddhism or meditate or anything, But then after about 1618, when he became responsible for his people and when their country was invaded by the Chinese, when he was 15 years old, he began to take it more seriously, and then he found it to be a true source of inspiration and enabling him to deal with the difficulties. So all of that is in here, and people see it in terms of a life study. And there's also a drama because there's a lot of bad guys. The bad guys actually are the Chinese Imperium, who under the pretense of liberating Tibet colonized it, like any kind of colonial conquest. And then out of in order to make their lie true, that they always owned Tibet and it always was part of China, Tibetan culture they have to extinguish if possible. So it looks like Tibetans always had Chinese culture. Because Tibetan culture totally proves that Tibetans were Tibetans. And they're happy to be related to the Chinese and neighbors of the Chinese and friends with the Chinese and buy some good noodles from the Chinese. Although actually they invented the noodles. The Tibetans did, because high altitude cooking is the cause of the invention of noodles, because of the difficulty to bake at high altitude. Chinese scientists themselves say that, and archaeologists. So they're, but they're just not Chinese is the problem, But they're happy to be related to the Chinese. And Chinese can be a multicultural society if they learn that, rather than just trying to suppress it. And that's what the Dalai Lama is confident they will. And I'm also confident they will. I expect a big turnaround on the part of the Chinese leadership personally. And but when, we've been expecting for some time at different moments, and when is the question, Because we've been disappointed, and nobody more than the Tibetans, and nobody more than His Holiness, and yet he remains joyful, cheerful. He realizes that the more powerful approach is to be happy and friendly, and to reach out even to the ones who are harming you in a friendly and happy way, and he has always done that. And that's so inspiring to people.
And can you tell me, Bob, who are you hoping will read this book?
Everyone.
Receive this inspiration?
Everyone. And the comic makes it readable by younger people. And already we've had a lot of feedback from some younger people that a story about the history of the Dalai Lama, 81 years, would be hard for them. They might read the beginning and then get lost in it, But because of the pictures and because of the action. And it is a drama, although unfortunately, we couldn't end the book returning to Tibet with the Dalai Lama to a newly culturally liberated Tibet. He doesn't want politically to divide off from China. He doesn't want to separate Tibet from China. That he makes very clear, and the book makes that very clear. He's happy to be part of a loose reigns Chinese union, where the ethnic minorities have their own culture freedom, like they're promised in the Chinese constitution, actually. That's all he wants. He doesn't want to split off, as the Chinese pretend that he says he wants to split off. He does not. Of course, they've suffered from the Chinese, the Tibetans, and many of them do, but they would follow the advice of His Holiness. They love him so much, the Tibetans, that when he says, vote to stay in a plebiscite, to stay in the union if China lets you have me and your culture and your lamas and your Buddhism and your way of life and your environment, and that stops ruining it, stay with them. And actually they did a little ruining in the first wave of colonialism, and now they're in a position of wealth and so forth where they could do restoration. They could rebuild, they could replant forests, they could refix desertified grazing lands and so forth. And that's what they want, and stop mining in a polluting way. And that's what they must do.
So what would you say the legacy of the Dalai Lama is, and how is this book bringing forward that legacy for future generations?
Well, his fellow Nobelist, José Ramos Horta, who was one of the two Nobel, shared the Nobel Peace Prize in East Timor, finally getting independent, rather painfully, but independent from Indonesia, if you remember, at a conference that Tibet House, US, organized in San Francisco 20 years ago now. He said that since the Dalai Lama's attempt to free his people is nonviolent, it has always been, in essence. There was some violence of some of the Tibetans who didn't follow Dalai Lama's lead, which he asked them not to, and finally they realized it wasn't truthful and they stopped. Basically he's always been nonviolent. But anyway, he said because it's nonviolent, if it succeeds, then other liberation movements in the world will succeed. Because the nonviolence will be so satisfying. Because nonviolence is a win-win. It doesn't leave China with a black eye or a loss of face. It gives China the opportunity to be the generous China. And also it gives it the ability to keep Tibet within its sovereignty voluntarily by the Tibetans if they're treating the Tibetans well and honoring them and honoring their culture and allowing the Tibetans even to teach Buddhism within China to the many, many millions, hundreds of millions of Chinese who love Buddhism and who lately in the last 50 years have gotten to really love Tibetan Buddhism actually. And this is China has the opportunity to be the generous, for not losing anything, not losing face, but actually solving the problem of the sort of unhappy minority. And then as an example for the Uyghur people in Xinjiang and even the Taiwanese, that the union with Chinese is not a smothering embrace. And the Hong Kong people will be relaxed and happy, and the Taiwan people will be relaxed, and any other of the 40 or 50 small minorities that exist in China. So it will be the key of complete turning China into more of a melting pot, rather than a Han chauvinist sort of thing that they so far have been behaving.
So it sounds like the legacy of His Holiness is truly nonviolence, and that this book really brings forward and demonstrates that legacy in an accessible and easy to understand way.
Absolutely.
I want to
and it has humor, and there's lots of fun in it, and His Holiness's sense of humor. There's heroism, there's disaster, of course, and there's some humor. I even poke a little fun at Nixon and Kissinger and people like that here and there, And then there's some tragedies, that are part of the life, part of the reality. It would have been silly to do a life of Dalai Lama and make him like saintly and he's so happy and everything's fine, and ignore the tragedies befalling his people that he thinks about every single day, and yet he's able to react to tragedy without hatred and bitterness. A little bit frustration, yes, but he's able to remain even loving his enemy. He's putting that into practice, and he's making us see that we can do that. It isn't just for the prophet or the leader or a few saints. We all have to rise to a different level of human behavior to have this century of peace that he promises us, and which the people want in the world, and the government should really not be oligarchs, but they should listen to their people. It's what the message is.
Bob, this is a wonderful message, and I just want to thank you so much for writing this book.
Thank you.
And I wish you the very best with it.
Oh,
and may all beings find peace.
Thank you, thank you. And here it is. Go out and get it.